You probably don't realize it, but you've seen players do this thousands of times, and you've done it yourself thousands of times. But the thing is, you don't really think about it. Not as much as you should anyway. It's a secret hiding in plain sight, and pros, they have been using it to their advantage for generations. You can see Arnold Palmer doing it at Royal Troon right here. And Tiger Woods here. Here's Jack doing it. And Stenson and Phil doing it here and here. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm talking about where players tee up their golf ball. Something that on paper seems a little boring. A tiny detail which comes down to a matter of a few degrees. But believe it or not, those degrees start to add up. They start to add up in meaningful ways. If you don't pay attention to them, you can end up hitting decent shots into bad places and be left with no idea why. Where you tee up the ball is a small decision you make at the start of every hole, but it's one of the easiest strategies to use for pros and amateurs alike. It can drastically change what happens next. Take it for granted, and it can make or break your entire game plan. Traditionally, when it comes to picking which side of the tee box you should start from, the advice is to subtly hit across the fairway. If your stock shot is one that moves from right to left, that means teeing up on the left side of the tee box, so you're aiming slightly more out to the right side of the fairway. Young Justin Leonard used to hit right to left draws throughout his PGA Tour career, and it's why you can spot him teeing up from the left side of the tee box so often throughout the 1997 Open at Royal Troon.
When I'm trying to draw the ball, I like to get on the left-hand side because it pushes my eye down the right, because that's where I want to start the ball. So I feel like I'm giving myself visually more room to start the ball and bring it back from right to left.
If your shot shape is the other way around, a shot which moves from left to right, then you do the opposite. Tee up on the right side of the tee box so you're aiming subtly out to the left side of the fairway, and then let it rip. Troon winner Todd Hamilton was a classic left to right fader. It's why you could see him constantly teeing up deep on the right side of almost every single tee box during his win at the 2004 Open. Generally, players say adopting this tee box strategy helps the drive fit their eye, but they also intuitively figured out that teeing up this way meant their drives covered more surface area of the fairway. So it's a rule that still works, and generally speaking, this is still good advice for most players to use on straightforward holes. The problem is most golf holes aren't straightforward holes. Usually the tee box is off-center, or the fairway is tilted in a certain direction. And that's when you start to see more interesting strategies emerge. To understand why, the best place to start is once again with this guy, Mark Brody. About 10 years ago, Brody used advanced analytics to find that PGA Tour players have a margin of error of about 3 to 4.5 degrees either side of their target off the tee. A 90 shooter has a margin of error closer to 7 degrees. When you equate these degrees to yards, each degree offline adds up to between 4.3 and 5.3 yards. It was by framing things in terms of degrees of misses that helped golfers figure out the best way to aim, which you can learn more about in our video right here. But it can also highlight how important something as small as where you tee up your ball on the tee box is. Because where you tee up the ball can spot you a few extra degrees to one side or the other. It can give you, in other words, a miss buffer. Here's a great example from Royal Troon. It's the 11th hole. The landing area of this fairway is about 30 yards wide, and the whole fairway is tilted about 17 degrees to the right. It has literal railway tracks down the right side, which is obviously out of bounds, but there are gorse bushes to the left of the fairway, so you can't just bail out and aim more left. If you're an amateur golfer playing this hole and worried about slicing your ball out of bounds onto the tracks, teeing up on the left side of the tee box creates a miss buffer out to the right, because a 7-degree miss to the right now has to travel over more land in order to end up in trouble. You've spotted yourself an extra 1.5 degrees worth of right misses, which is about 10 yards, without changing where you're aiming. Just by taking a few extra steps to the left of this tee box, you've made life a little easier. You create miss buffers on the opposite side of where you tee up the ball, and you can see pros creating miss buffers often on par 3s, like Henrik Stenson during the final round at Troon in 2016. That day, the holes were cut deep to the left on both those greens. Fearing a short-sided miss to the left with nasty pot bunkers lurking, Stenson teed up way to the right on both of these tee boxes. That meant he could approach the green more from the right, which aligned the middle of the green with the pin, and opened up a miss buffer of about 10 yards left of the pin. He ended up using that miss buffer on the 14th hole, which he birdied. In all, he played the 2 holes in 1 under and won the Open because of it. Bryson DeChambeau used this tee box strategy throughout his final round at Pinehurst during the US Open. He was struggling with a right miss all day during the final round, so often you'd see him tee up way on the left side of the tee box. This aligned him more with his target and gave him a buffer out to the right, which allowed him to control the run out of his misses, which was especially important on the firm and fast conditions at Pinehurst. So while pros generally use where they tee up the ball to create miss buffers on one side of the hole or the other, there's one big exception to this, and it's the wind. If the wind is blowing from left to right, for instance, a right miss may go 8 degrees to the right, whereas a left miss may only go a degree or 2. Or it may go from 2 degrees to the right to 6 degrees to the right while the ball is in midair because of a strong gust of wind at the last moment. Pros call this getting gusted, and yeah, again, they really hate this. In the past, players would often try to work the ball towards trouble. But look at the 18th hole at Royal Troon, and you can see how that could occasionally backfire. In a playoff with Mark Calcavecchia in 1989, Greg Norman did the conventional thing of the day. He teed up on the right side of the tee box and tried to ride the wind towards the bunker on the right side of the fairway. He smoked his drive, but it just didn't stop rolling. It rolled across the fairway all the way into a pot bunker. Norman didn't even finish the hole. He lost the tournament right there. Norman got really unlucky, and it's easy to Monday morning quarterback on this stuff. But teeing up on the left side of this 6-yard wide tee box and aiming at that same spot gives you about a 2 degree more miss buffer to the right. 2 degrees on a 300-yard drive adds up to about 10 yards. Spot Greg Norman half a degree here, and his drive avoids that bunker. He's probably got another Open trophy instead of another major heartbreak. It's perhaps fitting that Stenson, when it was his turn almost 30 years later, teed up a few yards left of Norman on this hole. He aimed at a similar spot and stayed on the grass by just a few yards.
No, he's not done a Greg Norman. Oh, he very nearly did a Greg Norman. Greg drove into that bunker in 1989.
Using the tee box can provide a tiny little advantage, which, again, you can do for yourself, just like the pros. You're allowed to pick your starting position 18 times around. And you should. Because yes, it may be a tiny decision of just a few degrees. But those degrees add up. And sometimes it just takes 1 degree to make all the difference.